Hello everybody and welcome back to my channel. I've been wanting to make this video for quite some time. And honestly, this isn't really anything new. You've probably wondered this question yourself, whether or not you are religious or non-religious, but because this is my channel, I thought, whatever, I'm going to give my influence like I do with every single one of my videos, obviously. So the question, why is there something rather than nothing, or why something rather than nothing, honestly is an incredibly stupid one for me. I really don't understand teleology. Fucking hate that word. It's such a mouthful to say. Teleology, whatever. Well, basically, teleology, from what I understand, is basically focusing on the end goal of something, like its purpose. And that's something that I've always struggled with because I have a pretty nihilistic outlook and I know that nothing actually matters. Nothing has any real purpose whatsoever. So I always thought that this whole like why something rather than nothing, why is there something rather than not anything, to be like a stupid question, honestly, because I think it's a pretty good symbolism of the mental gymnastics that a lot of theists and religious people have to use because it's said in a way that's, asking for like some sort of like exploration, but honestly, it just has teleological undertones. There are many forms of this question. So, like, basically, what created the universe? So, basically, for example, in that question, it already presupposes that there is supposed to be a purpose. It already presupposes that like there is supposed to be some sort of like creator within it, and I think it's rather like fucking stupid because honestly, I've always thought that if they were asking that question genuinely and with something that requires, actual curiosity, the question would more so likely be, why did there have to be something rather than nothing? Not why is there something rather than nothing? Because that question is already framing you to think that there must be some sort of like a reason or explanation as to like why everything is here. So I think every single time religious people, theists and whatnot, posit this question to, like atheists, they're not even asking themselves that question like genuinely, whether to us atheists or whether to like, themselves, because they already have the agenda of God, basically. And another way I guess it can also be put is basically what created the universe, essentially like what started the universe, like drawing some sort of like like thing where there had to be some like first unjust cause, and basically that would be God. But I think that's pretty fucking stupid, because if you were to ask the question sincerely, why, like blah blah blah, you're supposed to figure out where exactly that leads you to. And I think that's pretty much the reason why a lot of like atheists and secular people are empiricists. Well, I happen to be an empiricist and whatnot. And I guess like it reminds me of like my problem of like criterion video, or I guess like my nominalist video as well. Because the need for structure and organization is a bias that human beings place upon, the universe. There is no reason that the universe has to make like any justifiable, like sense for us. So, sure, you see material, everybody sees material, like all around, and for a lot of like spiritual and like religious people that's not good enough, so they need like a sense of fulfillment. But I think it just encapsulates the mental gymnastics that a lot of people had to do in order to like just survive back then. Like, I am of the believer that essentially the only reason that religion is still standing up until this day is basically tradition. And because we're like a social species, people have a bias for tradition, which is why there's a appeal to tradition fallacy out there. If you didn't know, you should look that up. I think that's pretty much like the only thing that religion tries to like ground itself upon. Oh, we need spirituality or some sort of like religiosity in order to be like fulfilled and like stuff like that. But in actuality, I think it just references that people then and even people now cannot deal with an existential crisis, basically cannot deal with nihilism, basically, so they have to think that like there must be something higher or something like in charge that will protect us or like take care of us. Basically, this would be quote unquote like the heavenly father and whatnot. But if you think of like the definition of like I guess like religion and like God, how is it not anything other than like the projection of like a fairy tale, basically? Because kind of like what I said, the material world wasn't good enough for people. So they had to make like arbitrary, like nonsensical definitions that there must be something else out there that doesn't occupy space and time because they're too weak to handle that this, material universe does not actually, like care about them. And basically to like live human life is to just like fuck around up until you die and basically you're just like gone forever essentially. So I do want to get really like technical and like semantical about this because I think when it like comes to it, why or you know the universe, whatever, and all that kind of stuff. If we start from like scrape everything off and like start from like the bottom, you don't know what you're asking when you ask that question. To be honest, so like sure, I've seen Alex O'Connor's video with unsolicited advice. And I think like they do point out that basically, okay, this is a question that nobody can actually answer, whether or not like you're a theist or an atheist. But because like it draws parallels to me to like the problem of like criterion basically. So like where does knowledge start? So like in order to ask the question, why is there something rather than nothing? It's almost like asking, okay, like what is the beginning of like what we know, the foundation? Because like I guess like you know, the inquiring of knowledge basically starts within like a question, and the problem of criterion addresses two questions that people feel the need that they have to answer. So basically, what propositions are true and how do we tell what propositions are true? And a lot of religious thinking likes to rely on, like axiomatic like assumptions before figuring anything out. And that's why I'm saying that's why I think it is simply mental gymnastics because they want the start and they want the finish. They don't actually care about like what's in between. So I think honestly that's why when you argue with a lot of like religious people, yes, it's just mental gymnastics all over the place because they're not actually, you know, curious about what that question actually entails. Because if they were, and I think if we all were, if we're just being honest about it, we don't know how to answer it. So therefore, that is the reason for human existential crisis. That is the reason for basically nihilism and nothingness. And it's such a stupid question because yes, I am going to get semantical. So, if you twist the definition of the universe, I guess you can simply ask, okay, what started the universe? What created the universe? If you assume in the definitions of what you're saying that there had to be something before the universe, yes, okay, maybe you can like presuppose a god. Maybe you can, presuppose like a creator and whatnot. But it's like, I'm pretty sure, as far as I know, that universe is a pretty like scientific, I guess, like empirical sort of like terminology. So if I simply just ask you, how do you define the universe? The universe is basically everything in which all things are contained. So if you're talking about things outside of the universe, if you're talking about things that don't occupy space and time, you're basically talking about things that do not actually exist. Because if I were to also ask you, how do you define something that doesn't exist? Can we agree that defining something that exists basically has no interaction with anything else? It doesn't occupy any space. It doesn't do anything whatsoever. Then essentially you don't get God basically anywhere because then what we can understand from that is that God is basically a projection. It doesn't exist anywhere in the universe other than your mental properties and need for security. Because basically, sure, human beings, require or seek out for security, but where is it that you see it within the universe itself? That's why pretty much we're like a social species because sure, these inanimate objects do not communicate with us in the same way that like we do. Well, unless you're like a pantheist, I think, or like there's that one perspective, I forgot what it's called, but basically they believe that everything is essentially a living thing. But I'm not going to talk about that because I'm simply going to talk about like classical theism in the sense of like, okay, there's a God and like there's like a creator and whatnot. So if you consider, like all of this in mind, it is such a nonsensical question to ask what caused the universe because everything that happens exists within the universe. If you're talking about things that go beyond the universe, then you're not talking about the universe. Therefore, it, doesn't merit the question basically, why is there something like, like rather than nothing? Because these are things that are here. the universe is here, regardless of whether or not we understand the universe is a completely, different perspective. And that's why I'm saying, okay, perhaps look into mereological nihilism, because in all honesty, it's pretty much impossible to know how something begins to exist or how something, begins to start, quote unquote, whatever that means, whatever it means for something to be like self-evident. This universe is self-evident, regardless of whether or not, you understand it. So sure, I would consider myself a mereological like nihilist in that sense, but I am still a naturalist in the sense that like regardless of like whether my comprehension of this universe like makes sense or not, all I know is that this is insistent. And what I know is that it's not God. Because oftentimes, and I've even had some people leave it in my comments, I think. Or I remember like one particular comment in like one of my older videos is that okay, I lack a spirit. I basically I lack like a spiritual understanding or like a divine understanding or something, and that's pretty much like why um I guess like I'm miserable. But I just can't agree with that because I think like okay, the default state of the universe, well not the universe, but maybe like ourselves is to be miserable because all of this is built on cognitive dissonance. You need to keep yourself okay, like yeah, the reason people keep existing is because they do things that basically just prolong their death, but that's basically all, it's all gonna like essentially lead up to, as far as, I'm aware. So basically, nothing could have created this universe, honestly. It's a mereological, like nihilist mess. And even if there is an answer for as to how something actually begins to start or how something like without making some like base, like fundamental, like axiomatic assumption that like, okay, God is just self-evident or the universe is just, like the universe is more self-evident than God. Because even if I don't understand it, I will constantly interact with it, regardless of whether or not I understand it or not. That's why science is always doing empirical testing. That's why, you know, science is willing to shift its understanding of the universe if contradictory things affect the way in which we test. So basically, testing first, axioms second. So basically, yeah, I think it's kind of just like basically like nonsensical because people will say that God is beyond like human comprehension, basically. So we can't even begin to like start, quote unquote. And yeah, that's true, but are you not using human definitions to say that God is a is a thing beyond human comprehension? So like see when you just consider like the mereological like nihilism of it all, like it doesn't make any sense. Or like we either will never have the answer to that question, why something rather than nothing, or it would just appear that mereological nihilism is true fully, and we will never get the answer to that question, why something rather than nothing, because basically, in the same parallel, why did there have to be something rather than nothing? That's basically, like the more like appropriate question for me because it doesn't make sense. That actually tells me that there didn't have to be anything rather than, something. So just because there is something, it literally makes no sense to assume that there had to be something. And yeah, I guess I would just recommend watching my like nominalist and like universalist sort of like video again because I think the caricature of God, other than our need for like security and comfort that like somebody is looking after us, is basically our bias, kind of like what I said earlier within this video, that like we project the need for things to make sense, and God, the idea of like a creator, is basically a mastermind, complete sort of like organizer. But I would simply just argue that the universe is not obligated to like make sense for you, and you're gonna die. So even if humans have a hard time wrapping their heads around that, yeah, it's hard for us to understand that we're simply just gonna like lack experiences, and that's why we constantly live basically in a state of cognitive dissonance. So basically, the question, why is there something rather than nothing? It doesn't matter because there didn't have to be something. There didn't have to not be something either. So basically, those are my thoughts on that.